Thank you, Brigadier Saigal, for making my job eminently easier with that very macro picture of what the situation in Asia is as far as the nuclear domain and the strategic domain goes. Um, Let me start with thanking Ikriyar and Sanjay for the opportunity to come and speak at the conference because I also want to sort of thank you. I also want to keep uh, time. I'll go through in this in 15 minutes. Thank you. Um, I'll start off and in terms of introduction, we have heard about the rise of China, the emergence of Asia, which has altered the balance of power in the region. And why it's important to look at the nuclear angle is because of the fact that of the 9 states armed with nuclear weapons in the globe, Asia, if you define it in a very broad this thing, is home to 6 of the 9 states. And it is one of the regions which has also witnessed expansion of fissile material stockpile, a very rapid expansion of fissile material stockpile in Pakistan, and nuclear weapons modernization in China, India, and Russia. But given the fact that I possibly cannot do justice to all of that in 15 minutes, I'm going to sort of narrow the presentation and keep the focus on China and Pakistan. And this is something that I have been working for the past couple of months with my colleagues at NIAS Bangalore. So this is part of an ongoing research. Looking at the larger picture, it's also sort of, these are the major sort of issues that are posed, that is China's effort to counter US dominance. We heard about that in the earlier, and I'm not going to sort of continuously repeat these, but if you look at national strategies of each state, they're based on an assessment of each nation state's vulnerabilities vis-a-vis their perceived adversaries. These vulnerabilities are shaped by a number of factors, from history to geography to their aspirations to their relationship with other major powers, especially the US in the region. And all these factors form a very set of interconnected factors that determine a country's perception of vulnerability. Just wanted to set that background before I go on to the Chinese nuclear strategy. 45 tests in all, and they have tests across the spectrum, right from low kiloton enhanced radiation to more modern weapons in the 95, 80, 95 kiloton range to sort of in 3 or 4 megatons. So they have tested across the spectrum from a few kilotons to about a few megatons. They have been moving from these longer range, largely liquid based missiles, the DF3, 4, and 5. And another thing which the Chinese did in the early years is also to look at assured retaliation, as the Cold Warriors did, through sea based sort of retaliation, the JL1 and the SLBM. But this project, as we all know, ran into a lot of technological bottlenecks. When fully developed in 88, the submarine was very noisy and could be picked up very easily. So in essence, it did not offer any stealth and sort of assured retaliation. So in a way, the Chinese were forced by this to look at an alternative way of deterring the US. Certainty of uncertainty is an interesting sort of title to an article by Wu Rishang in the Journal of Strategic Studies. Borrowed it from there. And so they were forced to look at an assured retaliation not via the submarine route, and one of the ways the Chinese did it was through by means of concealment, decoys, mobility, and moving from liquid missiles, which we saw in the earlier slide, 345A, to more solid fueled missiles. So they had this thing that because of the shorter times and the needed for these missiles to respond, also the fact that they were more mobile. And so there was a essence that these missiles will, some of them will always sort of survive a first strike. Simultaneously build a second generation submarine with sort of, which is currently still being worked. Another thing which the Chinese did in this kind of thinking was to develop platforms which can deploy both nuclear and conventional weapons. During the Cold War, there was this very clear separation between uh, nuclear weapons and non-nuclear weapons. So there was no sort of cause for this because they didn't want ambiguity to be there. They want to be very clear that there was this clear separation between the two. The US had some plans to put conventional warheads into the Trident SLBMs, but it was scrapped because of this very reason, that you looking at a missile, you can't figure out what warhead it's carrying, whether it's a conventional warhead or a nuclear warhead. They did not want that kind of a signaling to go out, or sort of their adversaries to read that. The Chinese could also have developed these kind of things, where they could have the DF-21, several versions of the DF-21 have, which carry nuclear and conventional warheads, have different physical characteristics, so they can distinguish it very clearly. But that is not the route that they took. So you have two DF-21 mods, the C, which is the ASAT, and the D, which is the ASBM, which Brigadier Sehgal spoke about, which are very similar when you look at any picture to a DF-21 and 21A, which carry nuclear warhead. So they very consciously chose not to allow their adversary to make a distinction when you actually see pictures or imageries of these weapons. What this does is that this ambiguity raises the risk of a conventional conflict escalating to a possible nuclear war, and raise the stakes for an active US role, and this I am talking about Taiwan, or help or delay US involvement in a future Taiwan Strait crisis. This is one of the things that the Chinese also realized, that every time you had a Taiwan Strait crisis, the carrier battle groups would just come and park them, and the Chinese would be sort of, they wouldn't have any option to do anything else. This is one of the things that they're posing a question to the US. Are you willing to take the risk of escalating this kind of a thing to a possible nuclear escalation? Are you willing to take that risk, is the question that the Chinese are sort of asking the US. And talking about the DF-21, range of more than 2,000 kilometers, there is some speculation about that, but it's largely in that kind of a thing. The important point of the thing is that there was a missile, but the Chinese also decided to integrate this with their space and ground-based assets. The space assets like the ELINT, electronic intelligence, which would ideally come in and pick up the carrier battle group, which radiates a lot of electronic transmissions, followed by the SAR satellite and the optical satellites. Then they also had a large number of ground-based OTH, over the horizon radars, which would complement and give a better fix of the location. So the Chinese realized that space is a key enabler, and which is how the whole ASBM architecture was designed. This is the concept taken from a Second Artillery College article, 2006 article, where the Chinese put this out. This is fairly common, which is everybody who's been looking at this knows this. But the interesting point is the last, where because the carrier battle groups also moves. So when the missile is has taken off, by the time it reaches the point where the CBG was there, the battle group has also moved forward. So you need terminal maneuverability in the DF-21 missile, which is what the DF-21D has. This is the kind of operational configuration, starting from the ELINT satellite, then you have the optical SAR satellites, then they have the navigation satellites going to the OTH radar and the ground-based space network, which relays this and sort of takes the data, gives it to the command and control center. And so it was, in a sense, a very disruptive way of thinking of the existing systems, marrying it with new capability they put in over a period of time, and forcing the US to rethink its strategy, or long strategy that it had in the region. Another point that the Chinese decided to do is that they are not going to match the US in the entire spectrum of capabilities. They realize that maybe they'll go the Russia route and break the bank if they try to do that. So that is not what they are trying to do. What they are also trying to do is to sort of use the limited capabilities in a very unique way. ASBM is an example of that. That deters a new US intervention in a conflict over Taiwan. And by linking this to an escalation to a nuclear war by the clever use of ambiguity. Now, in game theory, as we all know, for a dominant power, it is very good. The best strategy is to be transparent, and that is what the US and the Soviet did during all the arms control treaties and those kind of negotiations. They give as much of transparency so as to give more stability, and that is what they did. But this is good for a dominant power, not for a power which is sort of trying to overturn the status quo, and which is also very much behind. If you see on the nuclear and the missile domain, you could say that the Chinese are comparable to the Americans, but they are fairly, as we saw, behind in the submarine, very much in the submarine domain and also in the aircraft. Now, I see Brigadier Sehgal nodding his head vigorously, and I also, there are sort of in the missile domain also, one can debate that point saying that they are behind, but they are catching up and they are doing things in a very different kind of a way, which is how, and they rely more on ambiguity, which is possibly the better route for a power which is sort of on the rise, which is not a dominant power. Coming to the Pakistan's nuclear strategy, and this is, we know that largely India-centric. They have used nuclear deterrent to threaten escalation of conflict to an all-out war, counter conventional asymmetry, which is Brigadier Sehgal spoke about in his introduction, the nuclear overhang used to continue support to the jihadi groups, and also bringing the international community at an early stage into. Now, what they have done since 2011 is introduce another element into this is of the battlefield nuclear weapons, the Nasr. Now, because after Operation Parakram, post-Kargil Operation Parakram, we sort of realized that we might need to move away from the 3-strike core to a integrated, more sort of a integrated battle group kind of a way, which are more smaller and they are sort of can go into the territory and sort of occupy small stretches of the territory. But Nasr takes this, seeks to take this space away from India, this limited action away from India. We have at NIAS, we had a report about this, which looked at the techno-political sort of analysis of this. And when you looked at the pictures which were put out by Pakistan, one could size that the dimensions available to fit a warhead was about 361 millimeter. And in this, if you look at the US sort of data, the US data is available out there, and they have, so the best case scenario is the US, and if you see that they have fitted in certain kind of warheads into this kind of a space available in the missile. But the problem is most of those kind of warheads and the tests that they did were all PU based, plutonium based, whereas the Pakistanis in 1998 never conducted a plutonium test. They only conducted a HEU, highly enriched uranium test. So HEU weapons are largely bigger than, they occupy more space than plutonium weapons. Second, the problem for Pakistan is also that each plutonium warhead weapon, plutonium grade plutonium requires more fissile material. And in essence, so you put in fissile material ore and you get out plutonium, you require for the same amount of plutonium almost double the size of ore to go in. So because they have very limited amount of fissile material in the country, they can't buy it from anywhere else. So they have this fissile material management issue also. And over and above that, they have not tested a plutonium warhead ever, which then sort of this claim that Nasr is nuclear, carries a nuclear warhead is under question. And the absence of a test, what is its deterrent value, is also a question that we have to sort of look, we have been sort of looking at. I'm coming to the end, sir. This is about, is Pakistan learning from the Chinese? And does the Nasr provide that kind of a thinking? Are like the Chinese, are they also trying to blur the distinction between nuclear conventional, subconventional? But there is a fundamental difference between the Pakistanis and the Chinese situations, given the fact that the Chinese have demonstrated via tests, via live warheads, flying on DF2 and other things that they did, of the fact that they have the capabilities. With the Nasr, the question is, the Pakistan has never tested a plutonium device. So that is the intrinsic difference between these two situations. So the demonstration of a capability or the lack thereof. That is the sort of distinction between the two. Another thing which we've seen in the literature is this very separation being offense and defense. The point that one is trying to make is that if you look at space capabilities, they can be used for both offense and defensive capabilities, ASBM, ASAT, C4ISR, and the rest. So that this is an artificial separation, offense, defense. And second, space is an enabler which the Chinese have realized, and we did 4 tests of sort of satellite launches last year, and they did about 15. So they have sort of gone very much far ahead in the space, and they have put in all these capabilities which made ASBM a reality. Third is the ambiguity and the attendant risk. There is also a move from clear separation of nuclear and conventional weapons to a place where there is an ambiguity about this. The resultant ambiguity also raises the risk of escalation, especially in conflicts and adversaries misperceiving and confusing these kind of interpretations, this signaling. Thank you.